Ladies and gentlemen, we are living in a moment of profound danger, yet also of immense opportunity. The world stands on the edge of war, not because nations inherently seek destruction, but because a small circle of warmongers have built their empires upon division, fear, and endless conflict. And at the center of this crisis lies NATO, an alliance that has transformed from a defensive shield into an offensive sword, slashing at the very fabric of international stability. Today, I urge you not merely to listen, but to awaken, because as the future we inherit depends on the courage we show now, NATO presents itself as a beacon of stability, a guarantor of security, and a protector of freedom. Yet the reality is far more troubling than the carefully crafted narrative suggests. The illusion of peace is its most powerful weapon, for by cloaking aggression in the language of humanitarianism and democracy, the alliance convinces the world that its interventions are noble. But let us pause and ask the uncomfortable question: if NATO is truly an instrument of peace, why does every intervention leave behind rubble, chaos, and endless instability? This is the truth we must confront, for the first step toward real peace is to strip away the masks, see power for what it truly is. Consider the history. In Yugoslavia, bombs fell in the name of humanitarianism, yet the aftermath was the fragmentation of a nation, the rise of deep ethnic divides, and a precedent that the military might can override international law. In Iraq, the rhetoric of weapons of mass destruction was used to justify invasion, but the world discovered only deception, and the people of Iraq were left with decades of war, terrorism, and destruction. In Libya, the call to protect civilians resulted in a collapsed state, a breeding ground for extremism, and generations robbed of stability. Afghanistan, sold as a mission to liberate and rebuild, ended in a chaotic withdrawal after 20 years of broken promises. Every time the illusion of peace was invoked, it led not to security but to catastrophe. This pattern is not an accident, it is a design. The illusion works because it appeals to our deepest values: freedom, safety, justice. Who would not rally behind a mission to stop tyranny? Who would not support the defense of democracy? Yet once the bombs fall, those ideals vanish into smoke, replaced with the grim reality of geopolitical chess games where the lives of ordinary people are mere pawns. The illusion is crafted not for the benefit of the people in whose lands wars are waged, but for the populations at home who must be persuaded to support foreign adventures. When NATO speaks of defending peace, it is often defending its own relevance, its own expansion, its own dominance. Here is the paradox that should stir our minds. The louder NATO speaks of peace, the more war seems to follow. Is this not reason enough to question? Is this not the moment to demand accountability? Every generation is told that these wars are exceptions, mistakes, or necessary sacrifices, yet the repetition of the same script across continents and decades cannot be explained away as coincidence. It is a strategy built upon illusion. And the tragedy is that the longer we accept the illusion, the more we normalize perpetual conflict as though it were the natural order of the world. What makes this illusion so dangerous is not merely the destruction it causes abroad, but the complacency it breeds at home. Citizens are lulled into believing that bombs dropped in distant lands are acts of compassion rather than aggression. Societies are convinced that the military expansion is the same as security, that confrontation is the same as defense. And so, generation after generation, the cycle repeats. The illusion robs us not only of truth but of the imagination to see alternatives, to see diplomacy, cooperation, and balance as viable paths. Yet history shows that illusions, no matter how powerful, eventually shatter. Empires built on deception inevitably fall because reality has a way of breaking through propaganda. The question is not whether NATO's illusion of peace will collapse, but when and at what cost. Will it take another generation scarred by war, another nation reduced to ruins, another confrontation spiraling dangerously close to global conflict? Or will people awaken now, while there is still time, and say with clarity the illusion has been exposed, and we will no longer be deceived. The first step toward genuine peace is not silence, not resignation, but recognition. Recognition that the words spoken by warmongers do not match the deeds they commit. Recognition that every illusion of peace hides an agenda of dominance. Recognition that truth, once exposed, is more powerful than any propaganda. And recognition that we, as a global community, have the choice to refuse this illusion and demand something real. A peace not built on bombs, but on respect, cooperation, and sovereignty. The illusion of peace has blinded us long enough. It is time to see clearly and walk a different path. Fear is the oldest tool of power, and those who thrive on conflict have mastered its use. Warmongers know that fear is the most effective way to paralyze societies, to silence dissent, and to manufacture consent for wars that would otherwise be rejected outright. Fear clouds judgment, suppresses reason, and convinces ordinary people that endless militarization is not only necessary but inevitable. It is no coincidence that every new NATO campaign begins with fear. Fear of dictators, fear of terrorism, fear of weapons of mass destruction, fear of some looming catastrophe that only bombs and military alliances can supposedly prevent. And yet, when the dust clears, we are left asking, did fear protect us, or did it merely push us into another cycle of destruction? This is why breaking the cycle of fear is perhaps the most revolutionary act of all. When we free ourselves from fear, we reclaim the ability to think critically, to question the narratives imposed upon us, and to demand alternatives to war. Imagine for a moment what happens when people stop being afraid of the manufactured threats and instead turn their gaze toward the real dangers. Endless intervention, reckless escalation, and the erosion of diplomacy. Suddenly the very foundation upon which warmongers build their legitimacy begins to crumble. Because without fear, there can be no justification for war. Consider how fear has been used to justify expansion. Every time NATO advances its frontiers, it insists it is protecting nations from some external danger. But this expansion itself creates new insecurities, provoking tensions that otherwise might not exist. It is a vicious circle. Fear is manufactured to justify expansion, and expansion generates more fear. The alliance feeds on its own shadow, and the world is told it must choose between some submission or annihilation. Yet the truth is more empowering. We are not prisoners of this false choice. We can break the circle by rejecting the manipulation of fear and demanding a system built on cooperation rather than confrontation. Fear also thrives because it exploits the human instinct to seek safety at any cost. Politicians invoke worst-case scenarios to terrify populations into silence. The people are told that speaking out against military adventures is weakness, that questioning NATO's motives is betrayal, that resisting war is naive. But here lies the greatest irony. True weakness is obedience to fear, and true betrayal is to allow fear to dictate the future of humanity. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, to speak when silence is easier, to question when conformity is demanded, to hope when despair is more convenient. History is rich with moments where fear dictated the course of nations. The Cold War was built on fear of the other side, with entire generations raised to believe that nuclear war was one heartbeat away. And yet, even in those darkest days, diplomacy and courage managed to prevail, reminding us that fear is not invincible. Today, the same fear is being recycled with new faces cast as villains, new nations portrayed as existential threats. But the script is the same, and the outcome will be the same unless we refuse to play along. If humanity survived the Cold War by recognizing the futility of fear, then surely we can do it again now. Breaking the cycle of fear requires a shift in mindset. Instead of asking, what should we fear next? We must ask, what future do we want to create? Instead of reacting to the narratives of warmongers, we must build our own narratives of cooperation, sovereignty, and peace. Every person who refuses to be governed by fear becomes a spark of resistance. And when millions choose courage over fear, the warmongers find themselves stripped of their greatest weapon. So let us not underestimate the power of breaking free from fear. The moment we stop trembling at the threats designed to control us, we see clearly that security is not built by missiles, nor by armies, nor by alliances of war, but by the courage to trust in diplomacy, in balance, and in the human capacity for peace. Fear is the cage, courage is the key, and the choice is ours to make. War is often sold as a matter of necessity, wrapped in the language of defense, morality, and humanitarian duty. But if we strip away the polished words and carefully crafted speeches, what remains is a very simple and uncomfortable truth. War is a business. It is not the ordinary citizen who grows richer when bombs fall and nations burn. It is the elites who sit at the very top of the system. The arms manufacturers, the political operators, and the strategists of empire who profit while others bleed. This is why wars never seem to end, because for some, war is not a tragedy to be avoided, but a commodity to be harvested. And so long as war can be converted into profit, peace will always be portrayed as narv or impossible. The question we must ask is this: who really benefits when entire regions are plunged into chaos? Every major war of our time reveals the same disturbing pattern. Contracts worth billions flow to defense corporations the moment a conflict ignites. Politicians speak of sacrifice while signing deals that fill the coffers of industries designed to produce destruction. Media outlets, owned by the same interests, flood the public with narratives that justify the carnage. It becomes a machine, a system in which every bomb dropped, every tank deployed, every drone sent across borders is not merely a military maneuver, but also a financial transaction. And who pays for this? It is the taxpayers, the young soldiers sent to fight wars that are not theirs, and the families who inherit nothing but grief. Look at the wars of the past decades. In Iraq, the rhetoric was about security and liberation, yet the war produced unimaginable profits for corporations involved in reconstruction, oil, and defense contracts. In Afghanistan, 2 decades of fighting yielded little for the people of that nation, but it created immense wealth for those supplying weapons, equipment, and private contractors. Libya was reduced to ruin, but defense companies recorded record profits from the weaponry expended. Every intervention leaves a landscape of destruction for ordinary people and a marketplace of opportunity for those who see war not as horror, but as opportunity. This is why the cycle continues. Wars do not persist because they are necessary, they persist because they are profitable. A permanent state of conflict guarantees permanent demand for weapons, military bases, and intelligence operations. Peace, on the other hand, is bad for business. When nations cooperate, when diplomacy succeeds, when regions stabilize, the flow of contracts and profit slows. For the warmongers, this is the true nightmare, and so peace is sabotaged at every turn, dressed up as weakness, as betrayal, as dangerous naivety. How convenient it is for those who profit from war to convince the rest of us that war is the only option. But we must open our eyes to the reality that every missile built, every drone designed, every fighter jet launched represents money that could have been invested in schools, hospitals, infrastructure, and the future of humanity. Instead, it is funneled into tools of death, tools that enrich a minority while impoverishing the majority. When we see this truth, the illusion shatters. The endless wars are not about freedom or security, they are about sustaining an economy of destruction. And if we allow that to continue, we are not just witnesses to history, we are accomplices in our own decline. Ask yourself this: if ordinary people truly benefited from war, would poverty still be rising in the most powerful nations of the world? Would veterans return home to neglect while corporations announce record profits? Would children grow up in shattered homes while executives celebrate quarterly gains? The answers are obvious, yet the machine rolls on because too many remain blinded by the propaganda that hides profit behind patriotism. Breaking this cycle requires courage, the courage to speak uncomfortable truths, the courage to question the motives of those in power, and the courage to recognize that peace is not only morally right, but economically sane. Because in the end, the people who suffer are not the ones making the decisions, they are the ones paying the price. And the people who profit are not those carrying the burdens, but those who manipulate fear and illusion for their own gain. The time has come to say clearly, we will no longer accept a world where the wealth of a few is built on the blood of many. Expansion is always justified as protection, but history teaches us that expansion has rarely been about safety. It has been about power. NATO's expansionist agenda is a perfect illustration of this reality. Each time the alliance moves its borders further east, it claims to bring security to vulnerable nations. Yet, with every step forward, the world becomes more unstable, tensions deepen, and the risk of war increases. It is a paradox that reveals the heart of the problem. The more NATO expands in the name of peace, the less peace we actually have. This is not a defensive alliance seeking stability. It is an advancing bloc seeking dominance. And unless we confront this reality, we will continue walking toward disaster under the illusion of protection. Think of the promises made in the early 1990s when the Cold War ended. Western leaders assured the world that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. That promise was broken again and again until the alliance surrounded Russia with bases and missiles, provoking the very tensions it claimed to prevent. Every step was justified by fear a new threat, a new justification, a new excuse for why expansion was necessary. But ask yourself, did Europe become safer? Did the world become more stable? Or did we merely replace cooperation with confrontation, diplomacy with militarization, and peace with the looming shadow of war? The answer is evident, though rarely admitted. This pattern exposes the true purpose of expansion. It is not about defending nations that supposedly beg for protection. It is about projecting power into new regions, controlling energy routes, shaping global trade, and preventing the rise of independent centers of power. NATO's expansion is less about the defense of freedom and more about the preservation of hegemony. Every new member state is not simply protected. It becomes a staging ground, a pawn in a larger chessboard, tied to the military and strategic interests of the alliance. And those nations that resist, they are demonized, destabilized, and isolated until their sovereignty bends under pressure. Here lies the danger that should keep us awake at night. Expansion is not a static policy. It is a momentum, a hunger that is never satisfied. Once one frontier is reached, another is immediately identified. Today it is Eastern Europe, tomorrow it is the Arctic, the Asia-Pacific, or even cyberspace and outer space. The expansionist agenda is limitless, because its goal is not security but perpetual dominance, and as long as it advances, it will provoke countermeasures, ensuring that the world lives in a constant state of confrontation. Can humanity truly survive under such conditions? Can peace exist when expansion becomes a permanent principle? The irony is sharp. Every new NATO member is told they are safer, yet in reality, they are pulled into the front lines of a global conflict. They host bases, missiles, and troops to make them targets rather than sanctuaries. Their sovereignty becomes conditional, tied not to their own people, but to the strategic needs of a distant alliance. Is this true security, or is it merely the exchange of one vulnerability for another deeper one? To confront the expansionist agenda is to ask these questions aloud, questions that warmongers hope remain unspoken. But there is another dimension we must not ignore. Expansion normalizes militarization as the solution to every challenge. It teaches societies that diplomacy is weakness and cooperation is betrayal. It frames the world as a battlefield where every nation must choose a side or be crushed. This mindset is poisonous because it leaves no room for multipolarity, no space for balance, and no chance for a truly shared future. Expansion is not just about borders. It is about shaping the very way humanity sees itself, trapped in endless competition rather than rising together in mutual respect. If the world is to avoid disaster, we must confront this agenda with clarity and courage. We must expose the lie that expansion equals safety, and we must remind ourselves that true security comes from stability, balance, and respect for sovereignty. Expansion will not stop on its own. It will only stop when people refuse to be manipulated by fear, when nations demand alternatives to confrontation, and when the illusion of safety is replaced by the reality of cooperation. For as long as expansion continues unchallenged, the world will remain perched on the edge of catastrophe, waiting for the next spark to ignite the fire. Power is often mistaken for the ability to dominate, yet history shows us that empires built on domination inevitably collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. The true strength of nations has never been measured solely in the size of their armies or the reach of their weapons, but in their capacity to engage in dialogue, to build trust, and to find solutions without resorting to destruction. The tragedy of our era is that dialogue has been deliberately devalued, painted as weakness, while dominance has been glorified as the only path to survival. But survival without dialogue is not survival at all. It is a slow march toward catastrophe. This is why choosing dialogue over dominance is not just a moral principle, it is the only rational strategy for a world on the edge of war. Consider the current global climate. The language of confrontation drowns out the language of cooperation. Nations no longer meet to solve shared challenges, but to threaten, to issue ultimatums, and to measure their strength against one another. NATO embodies this mindset, presenting dominance as a form of security, yet every show of dominance produces its opposite: resistance, defiance, and escalation. What could be achieved through negotiation instead becomes a battlefield, and every opportunity for compromise is lost in the smoke of confrontation. Ask yourself, if dominance truly produced stability, would the world be standing on the edge of great power conflict today? Or is it precisely this obsession with dominance that has brought us to the brink? Dialogue is powerful because it recognizes the humanity of the other side. It accepts that no nation can impose its will indefinitely without consequence, and that real solutions emerge when all voices are heard. Dominance silences, dialogue engages. Dominance provokes, dialogue reconciles. Dominance divides, dialogue unites. Which of these paths can sustain civilization in the 21st century? The answer should be self-evident, yet it is often hidden beneath layers of propaganda designed to convince us that dialogue is impossible, that enemies cannot be trusted, that force is the only answer. But history offers countless counterexamples: the easing of Cold War, war tensions through diplomacy, the avoidance of nuclear disaster through negotiation, and the building of bridges between rivals once thought irreconcilable. If it was possible then, why should it not be possible now? The warmongers fear dialogue because it exposes their weakness. Dialogue undermines the narrative that conflict is inevitable. It removes the justification for endless militarization. It empowers people to imagine peace not as a dream, but as a practical reality. And most importantly, it redirects resources away from destruction and toward creation. Dialogue threatens the very system that feeds on war, and that is why it is dismissed as naive or dangerous. But is it truly naive to believe in dialogue? Or is it far more naive to believe that humanity can survive endless cycles of confrontation without one day falling into the abyss? Think of the wasted opportunities. Trillions spent on weapons could have been invested in fighting poverty, climate change, and disease. Countless lives lost could have been spared if dialogue had been pursued with the same determination as war. Every time dominance replaced dialogue, humanity lost not only lives, but possibilities. Possibilities for cooperation, for shared progress, for building a future worthy of the next generation. The cost of dominance is not only destruction in the present, it is the theft of tomorrow. Choosing dialogue over dominance requires courage, because it goes against the grain of a system designed to reward aggression. It requires vision, because it asks us to see beyond immediate victories and recognize the long-term value of compromise. It requires humility, because it acknowledges that no nation has a monopoly on truth or righteousness. But above all, it requires faith in humanity's capacity to rise above its darker instincts, to build rather than destroy, to talk rather than kill. The question is whether we are willing to summon that courage, vision, humility, and faith before dominance leads us to a place from which there is no return. The truth is simple yet profound. Dialogue is not weakness, it is wisdom. Dominance is not strength, it is blindness. Those who choose dialogue will shape the future. Those who cling to dominance will bury it. The time has come to decide which side of history we wish to stand on. Power has always rested in the hands of the people. Yet history shows us how often that power has been surrendered to a small minority who manipulate fear, spread illusions, and profit from war. The warmongers thrive because people allow themselves to be convinced that they are powerless, that decisions are made far above their reach, that the destiny of nations is written in the halls of alliances and military councils. But this is the greatest lie of all. No empire can exist without the consent of its people, no war can continue without their silence, and no agenda of domination can succeed unless populations accept it. To seize the power of the people is to awaken to the truth that history has always been shaped not by the few who sit at the top, but by the many who finally refuse to be ruled by deception. Look at the past. Every movement that changed the course of history began with people who understood their collective strength. The fall of empires, the end of colonialism, the collapse of unjust systems, none of these happened because elites suddenly grew merciful. They happened because ordinary men and women, armed with courage and conviction, decided that enough was enough. The same lesson applies today. NATO's warmongers and their endless wars survive only as long as we believe their narratives, as long as we remain silent, and as long as we trade our power for false promises of security. The moment people rise, question, and demand accountability, the illusion begins to fracture. Seizing people's power is not about violence, it is about clarity. It is about refusing to believe that war is inevitable, refusing to accept that diplomacy is weakness, refusing to allow fear to dictate the future. It begins with voices that speak truth when lies dominate the airwaves, voices that remind society that sovereignty, cooperation, and peace are not luxuries, but rights. When these voices multiply, when they turn into movements, governments and alliances are forced to listen, for no warmonger can govern when the people withdraw their consent. That is the strength that sits quietly in every society, waiting to be unleashed. There is a reason why propaganda is so heavily invested in. Warmongers know that if people see clearly, if they understand who profits from war and who suffers from it, they will refuse to participate in the charade. That is why narratives are carefully constructed, why dissenting voices are silenced, and why endless fear is pumped into the bloodstream of society. But propaganda is fragile. It cannot survive the light of truth. And once people begin to ask simple but profound questions, why do we fight? Who benefits? What alternatives exist? The entire structure begins to collapse. The power of the people lies in their ability to see through the illusion, and once they do, the architects of war find themselves exposed. This is why the present moment is so critical. We stand on the edge of great power conflict, but we also stand on the edge of awakening. The same global networks that spread fear can also spread truth. The same voices that are silenced in one place can find amplification in another. Technology, communication, and awareness have created the conditions for people to unite across borders in ways never before possible. And when people unite, not as fragmented populations, but as a conscious global community, the very foundation of perpetual war is shaken. Because war depends on division, but people have the power to create unity. Seizing this power requires courage, yes, but it also requires faith. Faith in humanity's ability to rise above manipulation, faith in the truth's ability to overcome lies, faith that the will of the people, once awakened, is unstoppable, The warmongers have their strategies, their weapons, their propaganda, but the people have something stronger: numbers, resilience, and a longing for peace that no weapon can extinguish. The time has come to seize that power, to claim what has always been ours, and to remind the world that the future belongs not to those who profit from war, but to those who dare to demand peace.